I can tell you that it's not lost on me that last year, 4,000 new claims were filed with WCB. 4,000 new claims for mental health injuries related to work. And many are workers who routinely and inherently experience trauma because of the very nature of their work. First responders, who often witness terrible tragedies and suffer alongside with the victims. A national study in 2017 by University of Regina psychology professor surveyed thousands of emergency dispatchers, correctional officers, police officers, paramedics, firefighters across the country. The findings are astounding. 44% of them show that the sign of mental health disorder compared to an average of 10% in the general population of workers. What does that tell you? That our helpers need our help. While any worker injured at work can make a claim to work safe, but the eligibility for compensation requires proof that the injury is job-related. But when you're suffering from mental health or PTSD, the process of proving that your injury is work-related is re-traumatizing. So when the very nature of the job is recognized to have routine and inherent exposure to trauma that in turn has a high correlation to mental health claims for workers, why add to their suffering by having them to prove that we already know that their job is the cause? That's why we eliminated the requirement of proving in select professions where the risk of actual corresponding mental health injuries are well established, like the first responders. Then we expanded that to nurses, 911 dispatchers, and care aides just recently. Now they no more need to prove that the mental health injuries was caused by job-related trauma. Now it is presumed.
So before I begin, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Matt Johnson. I'm a Surrey firefighter, Local 1271. I'm more than honored to be here. It's the third time I'm presenting. In the last 2 times here, it was pretty nerve-wracking, but I've gotten used to a bit more public speaking. Of course, having to co-facilitate with Steve Farina really brought me out of my shell, I guess, too. So I think we should take pause and just recognize that a lot of what Labour Minister Harry Bains was saying was the result of a lot of hard work that you and the rest of the BC PFFA put together over many years. And it's something that should be recognized and celebrated today. The amendment to the Workers' Compensation Act to include presumptive mental health legislation, to me, is a landmark that makes me proud to be a firefighter. And this has only been since 2012 that I've been a firefighter. And I love the fact that there's another clause in there, which is bullying and harassment. We're setting a very strong tone in the workplace that things have to change. Because as Minister Harry Bains said, we're over 4.5 times more likely to suffer a psychological injury compared to the general population. So the evidence is there. So with that, I want to express some gratitude. It's been a long road, eh, Steve? 3 years, man. And so we have trained over 300 mental health professionals in what we call the Occupational Awareness Training Movement. And is Gordon in the audience by any chance? Gordon Todd? No? I just want to specifically thank them too, because they didn't just let me and Steve run, they let us sprint with a concept. And this is not an easy landscape to deal with. It's confusing, it's fragmented, it's largely unregulated, and quite frankly, every idea we had created another 500 hours of work over the last 3 years for us. So we're happy to get it to where it is today, and I'm proud to share it with you. So there's going to be 4 parts to this presentation. I'm going to talk about 4 guiding principles that really set the tone and the table for the rest of the presentation. I'm going to go into some of the depths of the current challenge, which Minister Harry Bains pointed out with some of the national statistics. Then I'm going to get into the Occupational Awareness Training Movement. I want you to know that every region of the province of BC has clinicians that have been trained under this model. And then I'm going to move into the whole concept of standardizing mental wellness programs among our locals, okay? So the first thing I want to say is there's no question that firefighters are naturally resilient. Just think back to when you were trying to get on the job, the amount of sacrifices you had to make, the amount of community involvement that you had to bolster your volunteer experience, the amount of sacrifices you had to make in your life, whether you're 21 or 35. It wasn't easy. 9-month processes, 4-hour psychometric testing, ride-alongs. It goes on and on and on. If you are not resilient, you wouldn't be sitting here right now. This gets lost when we struggle. So I'm going to talk about how we can instill hope in members that are struggling, because no matter how depth the struggle is or how deep it is, there's always hope. The other thing I want to speak about is mental health as an acquired stress injury. Okay, this is where we call it PTSIs, post-traumatic stress injuries. It's an acquired injury due to chronically high levels of stress, and as we know, sleep debt that compounds it. If there's one fundamental thing you should take away from this presentation, it's proper sleep hygiene. So I'm really happy to see that Dr. Glenn Landry is on the schedule, because that is what is consistent across every psychological disorder in the DSM, is a disruption to sleep patterns. And that's one universal we all have, because we're an essential service. Now, how did we get here? Well, we assumed that through behavioral training of doing things uniformly, that we could then essentially be interchangeable and respond to every call. And if you were here 4 years ago, you kind of saw me do this ham-brain model. And I talked about the 3 fundamental stress responses, the 3 Fs, shout them out: fight, flight, freeze. What are our options? Faint. It's in our title, Firefighter. So we have to override 2/3 of our stress response, regardless of what our personal triggers are, at any time of the day or night. Now, our brain took 280 million years to evolve this stress response, and the IAFF is only 102 years old. There's no way our brain has changed in 102 years. So this is an abnormal situation that we place our bodies into and our minds. So we're going to have some normal reactions to abnormal situations, which are post-traumatic stress injuries. They are recoverable. So career choice impacts our wellness. We are trained to suppress the fight and the freeze response. We are disconnected from our stress reactions. It's function over feeling. If you played hockey, you might have been hit by a puck and had known that your foot might have been broken. You didn't take your skate off at the intermission because you couldn't get it back on, playing through the injury. We have a history of doing that in the fire service with our mental health as well. It's called working wounded. We have personal value conflicts, and this is what's emerged in the last 10 years or so. So I know we talk a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder because it's in the media, but in reality, there's things like compassion fatigue and moral injury. You know, we don't have blood pressure cuffs or pulse ox, but we have intramuscular injections and naloxone on the truck. You know, you start thinking about that. We have a lot of critical thinkers. That's a pretty big jump in our span of operations with our protocol, right? So this is the basis to the complexity of psychological injuries. It's not simply post-traumatic stress injuries. It's a large, broad umbrella. And of course, we're supposed to slowly, methodically, without thought, transition from a paramilitary workplace after a night shift right into daddy daycare or field trips, you know, or cleaning the house or what have you. That transition is very challenging. And for the most part, we do a really good job with it. But very few of us put intention into how we're going to emotionally decompress from a night shift and how we're going to re-enter that household. And so we're really starting to train clinicians on having you guys, all of us, slow our thought process down. Maybe you drive past a leisure center after a night shift. Maybe you could jump on the treadmill or jump into the hot tub and then slowly think methodically how you want to enter your house. Because I've heard too many wives of firefighters say, I love it when my husband gets home. He's got his angry clean on, I let him do his thing, I go and have coffee, and 2 hours later, I can eat breakfast off a floor. I see some smiles because you guys are relating to that, right? So we're trapped in multiple worlds. And of course, confounding all this is the sleep disturbance patterns that we have. So Steve Fraser, I saw him earlier, starting these psychological tools, Resilient Minds, very promising, right? Getting upstream and getting familiar with these type of things so that it can safeguard us against when we're in the red. So I believe that when we have competent, accessible mental health care, that many of us will access it. How many? At least 50% of us, because that's what the research is saying. But I would say 100%, because I'm going to show you how being in the norm in our profession is really in the abnormal realm. Then the last thing I want to say, and thank you to Assistant Chief Robinson here, is that we're all in this together. Psychological injuries increase with years of service. If you're wearing a white shirt, you're part of us when it comes to mental health. So we need to work very hard to push the employer to recognize that generic EAP programs don't work for us. We're a special category of a municipal employee. So I believe in collaboration. So we want to rebuild self-confidence, overcome stigma, provide service access, and collaborate. When this is embraced, psychological injuries are going to start to decrease. So what is ADEPT, the current challenge? Well, in 2017, we found out of a survey of 6,000 public safety personnel that 44.5% of us struggle with symptoms consistent with one or more psychological disorder. We're on the West Coast. Guess what? Highest rates are on the West Coast, most likely due to the cost of living, pace of life. But the most important finding that to me was common sense is that operational stress injuries increase with years of service. So think about that from our cultural standpoint. Let's say we got 3 senior guys on the truck, and we have a rookie that just went to his first cardiac. The captain's 59, forced to retire in 6 months, just had his second divorce, lost a mother to cancer. Who's going to need the most help on that rig? Probably the guy that's heading into retirement, right? But we look to the junior guy. Hey, are you okay with that? And they've just had the biggest break in their life, right? They love the adrenaline, and sometimes, and I've seen it, the guy looks up and goes, what do you mean, the call cap? Oh yeah, no, I'm fine with that. You know, meanwhile, he's thinking of going to Coachella and Peru and all that kind of stuff, right? So this is my point, is that the healthiest time that we're on this job is when we're hired, okay? That's what Nick Carlton's research is saying. So many of you have seen the mental health continuum model. This is from Road to Mental Readiness. This is the adapted version that Dr. Shields uses at the Firefighter Resiliency Program. And it's pretty common sense. Thriving's in the green. That's the state we all want to be in, right? So that's where we're hopeful, well-rested. That's where we attack life with a lot of enthusiasm. It might be foreign to some of you. Sometimes it's foreign to me. But the nice thing about this model is that you can kind of go from one stage to the next, back and forth, or be a blend of different colors throughout the day. In other words, mental health is not static, okay? And that's the message I want you to take back to your struggling members, is that even though they're having a bad day or a bad setback, it doesn't mean every day is going to be like that. You might be in the green tomorrow. But you notice what the yellow says? Steve, can you read that term out in the yellow there? What does that say?
Normal functioning.
Normal functioning. That's the reactive phase in this model. This is the adapted version for us. So normal is not natural, okay? This is normal because of what the research is saying about our mental health. So this is an inability to be present, and this is a precursor to acquired stress injuries if we don't take care of ourselves. How does it look like? Well, Trudy Rondeau and Amanda Kumar, brilliant people at WorkSafe, have this ad campaign. Steve loves to point out it's his helmet in this picture. So this is what it feels like. There's this heavy feeling. It's more than a bad call or a bad day. It's like all the time. And the funny thing is, I'm not really sure why. So if you want to know more about the science behind it, this is our limbic system trapping our trauma and our cumulative stress, We can call it a backpack. We can call it a bucket overflowing. You've all heard those analogies, metaphors. And what happens is the limbic system, when it's overactivated, it can only whisper to our frontal cortex. And guess what? In fire culture, that's what it's all about, is it's training our analytical mind to make black and white decisions when everyone's in chaos. So we override this all the time until it overflows on a neurobiological level. This is when most of us go and get help. And we think that in 50 minutes, this poor therapist down the road is going to get us. And you may not know it. I know it from here, but you may not know it sitting there. We're a pretty intimidating audience, especially to the civilian therapists. So we definitely want to get upstream of this. So I want to explain this in a little bit of a different way, because what's confusing about this is if 44.5% of us are struggling, why aren't our time loss rates much, much higher? Well, it's because many of us are working wounded, okay? So what Nick Carlton said is that years of service increase our psychological risk symptoms, okay? And so what we have is if we cross that red, we can often power through it, sometimes for years. Sometimes we can push it down. We're experts at pushing it down. We're trained early on. You don't really share your true emotions, right? You could be arguing with your wife all the way on the phone to work. You get into the fire hall. How was your day? What are we all going to say? It's fine, right? So we can operate on the red for a long time. We also want to get to the thriving zone. No matter your political beliefs or what you do in your personal time, we all want to experience the downregulation of just being present in life. So now you kind of see the parameters around this. So throughout our career, what ends up happening is that work becomes quite addictive, right? The adrenaline spikes that we get, the types of calls we go to, we really like it. In fact, personal life can get quite boring, right? And so has anyone had their wives call them controlling in here? I know in my situation, I've been called controlling a few times. Why? Because the situational awareness that I was trained on in the fire service, that paramilitary way of looking at things, just pushes your brain to associate everything in your personal life with how things should be done in the fire service. You have to be very intentional about how you're going to put your mind into your personal life and leave the paramilitary stuff at work. It's a big skill. So what ends up happening is generally we're going up and down, you know, that fight, flight, the adrenaline response at work. We kind of crash after a night shift. And throughout our career, our bucket starts to fill. And so there's this general uptake of things that happen. And so as you can see, there's got to be a lot of intention put into this pre-retirement stage, okay? I'm not at a captain level yet. What I hear from captains is that acting captain time is a big stressor, right? If you go to the junior guys, it might be their EVO that they have to worry about. So we often flood our stress response throughout the course of our career many, many times. And when you're in your 50s flooding it, your body and mind isn't recovering like it was when it was 21, okay? So we literally have a harder time dealing with stress. And then what ends up happening, we have to retire. So this is where we want intention to kind of get into this stream of upstream mental health care that I'm going to speak about. Now, something that's emerging from the research that's been the elephant in the room, I think, over all the conferences I go to, is that there's this assumption that it's traumatic-related calls that we go to that create our mental health injuries. But if you're dealing in a toxic workplace, what the emerging research is showing is that organizational stressors are surpassing your calls of a traumatic nature for what's stressing you out. So we can do all the resiliency training we want, we can check the boxes of CISM, we can implement a peer support program, but if it doesn't influence cultural organizational change, nothing's going to change. People's mental health is going to stay status quo. And it's more pronounced in a paramilitary culture, or at least it can be. So let's talk a little bit more about this generation gap. So what we're seeing now is a movement of baby boomers kind of leaving the workforce. Very few baby boomers are left. And the people that are really running departments are now kind of the Generation X. But the problem is the baby boomer generation adopted a lot of challenging ways to look at life. Why? Because of their mentors. So what ended up happening is the fire service operated under the guise of tradition for many years, and it's been passed down and passed down. Steve loves to say the name, or the saying, firefighting is 100 years old, unimpeded by progress. I don't know why you get a laugh every time, but I don't. I don't get it.
It's all in the delivery.
It's all in the delivery. It's not my words. So what we have is Generation X now taking over the managerial roles. And remember that psychological injuries increase with years of service. And when we talk about our management style, in 2015, millennials overtook boomers and Gen Xers as the #1 largest group in the workforce. And I'm sure many of you see this and how much it's influenced the culture of firefighting, right? The technology, the disconnect, the four-corner fire hall kind of phenomenon that's happening. And I turned 41 last year. I'm starting to realize, being right on the cusp of Gen X and millennials, that I have a lot more in common now with captains than I do new recruits. So that's how quick this transition is happening. So if we think that traditional fire hall culture is really sinking into millennials, it's not. There's a significant gap in communication between management and executives and junior firefighters that we should be talking about. Because frontline people need say in how the future of the fire department should run. So an example of some changing leadership styles is Chief Daryl Reed being a guest columnist in the Star and admitting that he's had 14 colleagues who he's lost to suicide, and thankfully things are changing. This is a fire chief that is leading, obviously, British Columbia's largest fire department. And so this Generation X kind of message is very permission-giving. If you have the top leader in the organization talking about it, sharing it, not wearing it, it gives permission for other up, down, and sideways, as Daryl Reed says, or people in the organization to talk about things too. So we would like to assume that we have 53 locals in BC, all on one straight ladder, but in reality, we're all doing our own thing. There's 53 different collective bargaining agreements, many different EAP providers, different levels of champions of mental health in the fire service. So you can kind of see what's happening here, right? Is there's a complete lack of standardization in the field on all aspects of mental health. That's why we've gotten here. So let's talk about solutions. So when I think about the occupational awareness training movement, it really goes back to 3 years ago. WorkSafe and the BC PFFA Mental Health Task Force, they had identified the need to start training mental health professionals. And by the way, since I've been on LinkedIn the last year, so has every state and every other province in North America. I'm tired of people saying they're going to do it. I want to see action. And this is why I'm very proud to be up here, because the BC PFFA Mental Health Task Force took an idea and we ran with it, we sprinted with it. And that's why we're getting emails from all over North America about our model. So let me share this with you. But before I do, enough about what I think about firefighters. Let's talk about what David Kuhl thinks. So David Kuhl, Firefighter Resiliency Program Lead, he talks about firefighters as basically keeping their thoughts and feelings to themselves. Kind of that traditional 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 mouth mentality, right? That we were taught very early on, maybe even before pre-service, which means we don't ask for help. And when we do, we usually talk about it in retro. So in other words, what happened back in the day and how I solved it. In other words, what happens is we flight from vulnerability at all costs. And so we're shy from describing our emotional experience. This is really the power of the Firefighter Resiliency Training Program at Loon Lake, is that it gives firefighters permission to share, to realize that their struggles are actually universal, that they're very common. And this is truly life-changing and life-saving. So what happens when we reach out in the red? Pretty straightforward. Many of you are advocates on the job. You'd be familiar with this. Onset of more debilitating psychological crises and disorders, increased time loss, more disorder claims. You know, WorkSafe has a tsunami of psychological injury claims now from fire, and complex treatment with less effective outcomes. There's a reason why almost all the sponsor booths are inpatient treatment rehab facilities. Think about it, right? Great facilities, friends with many of those people. I'd love to see more upstream mental health care. I don't want to see our brothers and sisters having to do 60, 90-day inpatient treatment. This is a wonderful job. When we all got hired, we felt like we won the lottery. And when we struggle, we forget about all the great things this job has to offer us. And the number one thing that it has to offer us is a brother and sisterhood. And that's what can be changed. We can't change the traumatic experience that we witnessed or had hands on, but we can change the peer aspect. So peer support is such an important, emerging, high level of potential for being very good in the fire service. But we have to influence cultural change for it to show its full potential. So this is a typical encounter of a firefighter going into an office. We're pissed off. We're in the red. We've waited far too long to reach out. We've went down the street to a civilian therapist, right? And we're angry. We don't know about the EAP system. Every time we've called them, we've had a different mental health professional. Now you're so frustrated, you don't care what their qualifications is. I'm going to pay out of pocket. I'm here because my wife told me I should come here. You know, kind of mandated kind of mentality. And quite frankly, we trashed their office. And I know the other side of it, which is that many of you have been let go or fired by your therapist because you looked over and they were crying when you talked about your experience on the job. In other words, we flooded them with our experiences on the job and in life because it is inherently sad about some of the things we've seen in our life. So we need to acknowledge that. But what you have to understand is how fragmented the mental health care system is in BC and in Canada. There's literally no regulation. Anyone can call themselves a counselor. And unfortunately, the counselor that you're seeing is often a victim of this too. Why? Because they're not politicians, they're trying to make a living, and it's really the provincial issue that's happening, and it's had a trickle-down effect where they're just as confused as you are, okay? So we needed to clearly train clinicians on how to work with us. There was a clear gap, and there was a lot of interest from mental health professionals on understanding our world. And this is what they know about our world, everyone. This is what they're reading in the media, okay? These are things that are required for proper legislation and lobbying efforts, right, is a glorification of trauma. So if this is what our civilian therapists are seeing, you can't fault them for seeing us like this when they enter the room, or you enter the room, because you're in the orange or the red. And they look at you, and they know they work with trauma, because it's just like catching a hydrant. They've been catching a hydrant for a long time. Now they're actually out of fire, and they need to supply some water. You become, in some ways, their petri dish. They want to take their complex trauma training and start looking at it through the lens of that. Of course, we don't want them to look at us that way because we might be saying, it's about my child or it's about my wife. And of course, very rarely is it about us, right? We're good at deflecting the issue. So we need to have a very patient, loving, delicate therapist to build that rapport. And that's where it becomes very challenging for them. So this is what WorkSafe did. It's goal number 3 of 5 goals that Trudy had set forth, to develop a network of culturally knowledgeable, competent, credentialed practitioners. So going back to what we want, when we go into their office, that therapist, we want to talk about the call, or the hall, or the all, right? It's simple catchphrases, but so true. And you have to decide what is going to be your primary focus early on. because there's a very good chance you're going to flood them with a whole bag of stuff because your bucket's overflowing. So I want to take pause for a moment and just acknowledge that this is a picture of one of our first training sessions in Cranbrook. It was literally 5 weeks after Western Educational 2 years ago. And many of you were aware of Clay Morrell and Joan Morrell. And unfortunately, they died in a car accident just before our training session was to happen. So I thought this was an important picture to put up just to acknowledge Clay's memory, but also to acknowledge that we were going to do this in an active fire hall where we had our clinicians there. But given the circumstances, Cranbrook Fire was dealing with, obviously, planning Clay and Joan's funeral service. And so we held this in a beautiful classroom in Cranbrook. And we ended class early on the second day because of the celebration of life. And I think 22 of 22 people from our class went to the service. That's how caring these outside mental health professionals are throughout BC in our experience. So what do? Well, we put them in a fire hall setting. We leave the tones on. We want them to experience the calls, know what kind of calls are coming in on a daily basis. Steve usually does a play-by-play of the psychology of what the different firefighter roles would be on that call. Loves it. Sometimes offends the therapist by saying the call would be boring. And then we overview the structure of the IAFF, the IAFF Canada, the BCP FFA, the structure of what exempt staff versus memberships look like. All stuff that you might be thinking is pretty simple. But to an outside person, they're overwhelmed, right? So getting an idea of the structural hierarchy of paramilitary culture is really eye-opening and helpful for them. We talk about how our training, things like situational awareness, the early experiences as a firefighter, how that impacts us throughout our career. How our roles in our personal lives kind of become a scrambled egg when it comes to talking about trauma, right? How our personal life is affected by career choices. Almost every one of your spouses is secondary to firefighting. I don't know any firefighter that calls in to work and says, I can't come in because my child's sick. It usually falls on your other better half to call in sick, right? So we talk about how these traditional roles as a firefighter there is no day that we call in sick, and there is no type of weather condition that we can't get to the fire hall in. It's really eye-opening for these people. We talk about how they can adapt their approach, but we also, on day 2, take 3 off-duty firefighters from the local department that we're teaching in, and we hand it over to them. Steve does a great job of moderating a discussion about their different experiences on the job, and the clinicians get a chance to ask the Cranbrook firefighters, hey, how come you guys don't access our local clinicians? And then they can go, well, I just don't want to run into you at the grocery store. And then she goes, well, I'll tell you what, if you run into me at a grocery store, I won't acknowledge you. Oh, really? Yeah, no, I don't acknowledge you unless you acknowledge me and you want to have a conversation. But I keep that confidential. When firefighters hear that, it's again permission giving. You're reducing barriers to service access. And chaplaincy in the fire service, Chief Scott Young, new Chief Scott Young in Coquitlam, he talks a lot about the chaplaincy component, the hope and meaning and spirituality. You know, chaplaincy was around well before mental health was a professional organization and structure. So our history is spoken about with Scott as well. So overall, we end this with a tour of the fire hall, and they can interact with on-duty crews. This is just bridging the gap as much as I can tell you. We traveled the province, so this is Surrey, retired Chief Keon. We've got a group of therapists in Hall 2 and Wally there, learning about the truck, learning about the exempt staff's role in Surrey Fire. This is in Coquitlam, Sean Gios there and his staff. He sent 14 of his clinicians from Boreal Wellness into our training. These aren't really intimidating people. In fact, a lot of these people look like they could be firefighters themselves, right? So there's no us versus them. This is at the BC Burn Fund office in Vancouver. These clinicians were hungry for content. They loved it to the point where we couldn't put on enough of these courses. Kelowna Fire. We had to host 2 courses in Kelowna because there were 60 people that wanted the training. Another one in Coquitlam. So we try and ritualize this as much as possible to bridge the gap. And the on-duty crews are more than willing and awesome to talk about their experiences, brag about their job a little bit, talk about their challenges. This is about bridging the gap. If you ever wonder what 200 mental health professionals look like, here they are. So what happened is we trained 300 people, and nearly everyone said we want further training. So I went to City Hall in Surrey, and I put $6,000 on my credit card, and I kept my fingers crossed that I'd be able to get that money back. And then we put a lineup together at Duncan and David and all these other really well-established subject matter experts. And sure enough, we had 196 people sign up for it. So this is a movement, everyone. This is a movement that the rest of North America is looking at. And we're rolling. We're not going to give up. We're just going to keep this movement alive. And so here's a picture of Duncan Shields on the far right. Many of you would recognize him from previous Western conferences. Ross Laird. These are all subject matter experts. And these are people that Steve and I and Marcella and Gus are really proud to call our friends as well. And so what we do is we get them to train the clinicians in the advanced training, and then we videotape their whole course or presentation, and we give it back to the fire. We're eventually going to give it back to the fire service in the form of on-duty, in-station training matrices, where we've edited the content and we've made it highly relevant and as engaging as we can make it for your frontline staff. And then what happens? The clinician and the firefighter are trained in the same perspective. Again, closing the gap. So that's what I mean by simplifying mental health care. We're not in the business of changing the system, okay? That's well beyond our scope. We can't change traditional EAP issues. We can't change your extended health plans, whether RCCs or registered psychs are recognized. But we can simplify an approach that will lead to your members more likely to access mental health care. And so level 1, the 2-day training, we did a bronze seal of endorsement. Level 2, which is what we just completed, is silver. And we probably got another couple of years before we decide what gold looks like. It could be ride-alongs, it could be fire ops, it could be a number of things. So we're open for ideas, and thank you, Chris McKee, up there for designing these wonderful logos from Maple Ridge Fire. And so what happens is this seal of endorsement we encourage the clinician to have on their website and also their certificate of completion in their office, so that when one of your members walk in, there's familiarity with the BC PFFA in their office, right? They got the Share It, Don't Wear It campaign notice as well. This is a website, so here's the thing, is clinicians have an interesting way of marketing. They're primarily marketing towards their clientele, which tend to be female traditionally. So we realize that if we send out just their websites as a standalone, a lot of your membership might be dissuaded from accessing their services. So we have 150 clinician profiles on this website. This is a homepage, First Responder Health. All you do is you agree to access a directory, and thanks to WorkSafe for funding this, we have a VRBO-style interface which shows all of the clinicians in your area, your city of choice. You can zoom in, and you can click on any one of these profiles, and it's a customized profile to a first responder audience. Some of you might be going, well, why would that person be on here? Why? Because you have children, or your wife, your spouse. They're not all clinicians that are focused on just working with you. Sometimes we leave a wake, right, of our issues that impact our family. And so we even have play therapists on here as well. Each clinician on this directory has signed a 4-page agreement to do business on our terms. What that means is that when you call them, they'll get back to you within 24 hours. 24 hours, business hours, that is. If they're out of office until mid-February, that's fine, but get back to us a day later when you get back. If you have any issues with these people, you send an email to me or hello@First Responder Health. This is a free directory for the clinicians. We're not obligated to keep them on there. If they're not going to play by our rules, we'll kick them off, okay? We want to make this service work for you guys. The other thing I want to mention is that it's accessible. There's no user ID required, no login. And when we look at standardizing first responder mental wellness, as I mentioned, the landscape is very fragmented. Now, how many of you, show of hands, have gone to Hawaii? Okay. Does anyone ever worry about the flight path to Hawaii? It's pretty daunting, right? You're going over thousands of kilometers of ocean. The reason why it works is because they have some really advanced, standardized navigational tools on a flight, right, to get us there safely. Now, if a flight pattern looked like the mental health scene in British Columbia, would we want to take that flight to Hawaii? Probably not, right? So we want to work on standardizing mental health. And that's what's happening with Bill C-211. There's a trickle-down effect happening. Very few of us know what's going to happen long-term, but the rules of engagement are changing. Bill C-211, championed by MP Todd Doherty up in Prince George, achieved royal assent in 2018. They're looking at building a national consensus on post-traumatic stress disorder. So here we are talking about destigmatizing terminology, and the federal government still calling it a disorder. Very challenging. Bill 9, the amendment to the Workers' Compensation Act that I spoke about, not only including trauma at work exposures, but bullying and harassment. That's going to be a game changer. So when we get the conversation going, that's really what peer support, resiliency training, CISM, and employee assistance are about. And as I mentioned, there's a lack of consistency across the departments. So what we want to do is we want to look at expanding this model. Why? Because the cost of catching up on stigma is way too expensive. January 11th, 2020, I read these things almost weekly about another fire department or police service in Canada that has a lot of money that's going to overtime costs. Going to overtime costs mainly or partly because of psychological injury rates. And so what's it costing? Well, in this case, 64 residents with a budget of around $14 million. It's costing about $1 million a year to cover those members that are off on a consistent basis. And a lot of them are on psychological injury claims. So this is a cost of operating at status quo. So the question we ask is not how much mental wellness is going to cost us, but how much it's going to cost us if we keep operating status quo. How that's acceptable, beyond me. So what do? We need to look at mental health indicators. We got to manage our mental health. Every 3 months, I do my little mental health indicator on SIPCERT. It goes beyond this presentation. I can tell you all about it off stage. We got to integrate these occupationally aware clinicians. As I mentioned, every region in the province of BC has an occupationally aware clinician. There's also 40 in Alberta and 25 in Saskatchewan. So I know that some of you are from locals outside of BC. Jeff Reeder, Lloyd Zwack are very familiar with our model in Saskatchewan, and Brad Reedman in Alberta, so please talk to them as well. Psychoeducational training needs to be standardized. It needs to go quarterly. It needs to involve subject matter experts we know and trust, not another mental health expert that developed a program for us without consultation or collaboration. I was a mental health professional for 10 years before I got in the fire service. I'll tell you, I didn't know anything about the fire service when it came to mental health issues. You kind of have to be an insider to work with us. So we want to work with people that get us. We want to be able to easily access clinicians. And for rural people in smaller departments, it's hard to find a good clinician. So that's where we have a telemedicine platform through First Responder Health. We took our shining stars from our classes and we put them on a telemedicine platform. You can sign up online if you're in Williams Lake or Fort St. John or wherever, and you can see that clinician from the comfort of your own home. Clinical oversight and collaboration, key, okay? If you got a toxic workplace and labor management issues are problematic, again, those organizational stressors are going to be more significant than the trauma-related exposures. We need annual check-ins with members, and this is where it gets a little dicey, because if I came in, and I don't do this anymore, but if I was to come in and meet with you for an hour once a year, recognize all the challenges you're having in your life and say, see you next year, that's not ethical. But a mental health check-in once a year, followed up with a safety net of accessing me as an occupationally aware clinician, that would be my dream situation for our 4,000 members. And lastly, ongoing feedback and program evaluation. There's no doubt that Steve and Gus, who developed the directory, we're not always going to hit a home run. You know, we want to tweak things as we go along. And so we get feedback from the executive and from frontline staff about how we can do better. So you might say, Matt, this is way above what we can offer. I'm going to tell you guys, there's a city outside of the CBA in BC that did it. It's Fort St. John. We launched this program in December of 2019. And we did everything that you saw of the 9 elements on that checklist. And so Fort St. John has now implemented this annual standardized wellness check-in. They have regular access to occupationally aware clinicians online, because otherwise they're going to have to fly to Prince George to see a counselor every week. So this is what I'm talking about. And if you notice the seals there, City of Fort St. John, Local 2143, BC PFFA, all involved in this. Okay, this is collaboration. I got to give a shout out to Chief Daryl Blades in Fort St. John. Said, whatever it takes, we're going to do it. And Matt Crompton and Aaron Shepka, the president and vice president of their local, sprinted with it through their health and wellness committee. So I'm out of time, but I just want to show you a picture here. This is after our 3 days in Fort St. John. The 2 middle people are Caprice and Jim Keats. They're occupationally aware clinicians. Caprice is from Vernon. Jim is from Nanaimo. They flew up. I flew up from Vancouver to Fort St. John. They worked their tails off, met with all the members, 27 of them. Anyone know how many members are in Fort St. John? 27. Think about that. 100% of their members signed up for a mental wellness check-in. They have 3 exempt staff. 2 of 3 signed up. So this is my point, is we're all in this together. And this is us just having a quick little social at the end of the program. Deputy Chief Dan Simpson, off the floor there, he went from captain to deputy chief recently. Aaron Jepka's on the far left, he's the vice president. And there they are with their occupationally aware clinicians. So this is where the rubber meets the road. This is the potential this movement has. So I'm very proud of it. And when I think of the return on investment, if you really want those numbers, it's on that 2-page handout that's in your yellow binder there. $51 billion a year is lost every year to mental health in the Canadian economy. Every dollar spent on upstream mental health care, the return on investment is between $1.62 and $2.18. This is right from Trudy and Amanda Kumar's documents through the BC First Responder Steering Committee. So one thing I'd recommend in closing is you can contact me anytime, visit our booth up there. Gus can tell you all about the technical details of the apps that we have. And the last thing I want to do is just thank WorkSafe for their generous support over the years. Steve, you're like a brother to me. Thanks for being my traveling partner there and having a great time. And Todd, since you're here, thank you for always supporting the initiatives and kind of being a calm voice of reason in sometimes some very politically charged waters. So thank you, guys.